Welcome to another edition of Jews on Film. My name is Daniel Zana. I'm a video editor and documentary filmmaker and still a Jew. And with me, as always, is my co-host, Harry Ottensasser. Hey, Harry.
Hey, Daniel. As always, I am Harry Ottensasser. As you said, I am a former film major, a current Jew, and never have been called a serious man, but I could be. Could be depending on who you ask.
Well, we'll see by the time this episode is finished if you are the serious man that you purport to be. Today, we'll be discussing the 2009 film A Serious Man, directed by Joel and Ethan Coen. I believe they share directing credits, writing and directing credits by the Coen Brothers, folks who are known for such films as Oh Brother, Where Art Thou?, The Big Lebowski, A Serious Man, Barton Fink, Inside Llewyn Davis, Burn After Reading. The list goes on and on. But boy, this was a great film to pick for this podcast. I had not seen it in a while. When was the last time you saw it?
I had seen it a couple of years ago. The last time I watched it was probably about 10 minutes ago when I finished it up ahead of us recording. So it's going to be fresh in my mind, hopefully. Hopefully that means we don't make so many mistakes going through the plot, but I'm sure our listeners will call us out if we do.
Sure.
But I had seen it a couple of years ago and I just remembered watching it and thinking like, this might be the most Jewish movie I've ever seen. And I obviously wasn't watching in the context of this podcast that was,
Right.
Years away from existing, but I remember thinking, and we'll get into this, but just some of the language, the deep cuts, and then just the way that I would argue the Jewishness really thematically prevails. And obviously, this is all what we're going to cover in the next hour or so of the podcast. But just, I felt that even then, I think watching that from I wouldn't say a completely open mind. I had known that this was their most Jewish film back then, but it, revisiting it, it certainly felt, as I remembered, if not more Jewish than I had expected. But what about you, Daniel? When had you first seen it? And, what did you think coming into this rewatch?
That's a good question. I think I'm familiar with a lot of the Coen Brothers movies, and a lot of their films have traces of Jewish elements, and some, characters have Jewish lines and Jewish backgrounds and things like that. But like you said, none more Jewish than this film. I don't remember watching it before for the purpose of looking at it as a Jewish film. And I honestly, it's been a while. So there were some scenes that I remember, but other scenes where I was glad that I got to watch it anew, especially through the lens of its Jewishness for the podcast. And yeah, we'll get into it. But before you do, why don't you read the IMDb summary and let our listeners know what this is all about?
Sure. And we've got an interesting one for you listeners, especially if you've been keeping track to kind of how we've been not quite rating, but just considering these descriptions. And here it goes. Larry Gopnik, a Midwestern physics teacher, watches his life unravel over multiple sudden incidents. Though seeking meaning and answers amidst his turmoils, he seems to keep sinking.
Okay. That's fairly accurate.
Fairly accurate, but and what I was kind of alluding to is the fact that we have a sort of quasi ranking or just assessment of these movies based on their IMDb summaries, because we say, if they feel compelled to throw Jew in the summary, then that's kind of our clear giveaway. This is a Jewish film. And sometimes we would talk about how it wasn't there. And it's funny with this one, because I don't know if you noticed, but you can, just sort of hit go back, 60 seconds or so to hear me explaining it. But you'll hear there was no word Jew in there. And obviously this is just sort of written by, whoever submitted it to IMDb. And this isn't from the directors, and we don't need to read too much into it. But I do think that it's fascinating that this movie, which is inarguably very, very, very explicitly Jewish, I guess whoever was writing the summary just wanted to sort of generalize and maybe, universalize the messaging of the actual, structure of the film, but never actually spoke about the Jewishness, just about the struggling and the turmoil. So I thought that was pretty interesting.
Nice. Yeah, I think I want to get into it, but first let's take a quick break, because I am like chomping at the bit here to get into it. And there's so much to unpack. So let's take a quick break and we'll be right back. Welcome back to Jews on Film. We're here discussing A Serious Man. I like to start the film out at the beginning. It's a good place to start. I like that the first thing we see is a quote. It says, it's attributed to the commentary of the Torah. His name was Rashi. It's like an acronym for his name. And the quote says, "Receive with simplicity everything that happens to you." And I think the quote makes sense most after having watched the whole movie, or it helps to sort of like frame what's going to happen. Any thoughts on that quote up top?
Yeah, a couple. I mean, I also jumped when I saw it. First of all, and I'm going to say this a lot. There's a lot of things this movie does where it kind of really doesn't over explain itself. And that's true, thematically and with the moralizing of it and with all these questions. It's very metatextual. We'll get into this for sure, but the whole movie is about trying to find meaning and explanation, and they don't do that. But,
right.
Just the way that this movie, on a side note, just threw in Rashi, right? And you explain he's a biblical commentary from, a couple hundred years ago. And the way that they just put his name in there without, anglicizing it, without giving any explanation, without giving that background, it's sort of like, if of course, but also if you want to learn more, do the research, do that. We're not going to give you the sort of sweet version. They just threw Rashi in there. And I'm sure, I don't know what it is, but a large percentage of the people viewing the movie might not have even known, who that was or, what that was. So that on one note was very cool. But I also love the actual quote itself, because like you were saying, obviously thematically, it ties in huge to the way that, Larry is trying to find meaning throughout, to everything that happens to him throughout the film and just try to get understanding and explanations. But to me, it also just felt like this statement against, maybe don't try not to overthink everything, just accept it simply, take it. And that just felt like very Jewish to me. That's sort of like, and anyone who listens to this podcast knows, we're two Jews who probably overthink and stretch a lot of these movies to their sort of bitter end. But just that kind of at the top, try not to overthink this, just relax, enjoy it, take it in, I just thought it was it felt Jewish to me, but it also just felt like, we know you're going to overthink this movie. So just try to capture it on its simplest level, at least at the top. And I just thought that was cool.
I definitely feel like this quote could have also been attributed to Cy Abelman, played by Fred Melamed, just because his attitude towards everything, and we'll get into it, is just very don't fight the tide, just go with the flow, have a bottle of wine, give me a hug. Let's just go through it. Let's talk through it. So right after that Rashi quote, we have this really nice opening scene that takes place in an Eastern European city with Yiddish speaking folks. And it's sort of a parable, but the long and short of it is a man comes home. He sees a person on the side of the road who he helps out. He tells his wife this amazing story. The wife says, well, this person died 3 years ago. And then just as she finishes saying that and she discovers it, he knocks at the door, opens the door. They have this very interesting conversation because it's, they feel like he's a dibuk, a demon, and he's just talking to them. And rather than sort of embrace this weird situation, the wife just takes action, and all the while she's sort of picking ice and sort of talking to her husband. She takes the ice pick and she stabs the man in the chest. He starts laughing. They have a conversation about it, and then he walks out the door, more or less. We don't really know if he was a dibuk. We don't know if he was actually feeling better. And then he walks out the door. We also don't know what the connection is to the modern day story, but I wanted to get your thoughts on it.
That's a wild and incredible sequence. I know I read somewhere.
I loved it.
I loved it. I read a lot of reviews, people talking about those first couple of minutes and just assuming they had walked into the wrong movie or turned the wrong thing on. Cause it has nothing to do with anything, not quite nothing, but at least, story or content wise, it has nothing to do with the rest of the movie. Yeah. And I do think that there's a lot of cool ideas there. There's a lot of cool themes, right? Cause you mentioned that the sort of central husband and wife are arguing over whether this man that he says that he met on the street and that she claims died a couple of years ago. So that must be this demon. So they're questioning whether he's actually this dibuk, which was another thing where it's Jewish, Zohar, kind of spiritual deep cut that, they did give some explanation. They there's one moment where, she says they offer him soup and he says he doesn't want it. And she says, see, dibuks don't eat. And he's no, I'm just not hungry. But the movie definitely puts you in this position of not knowing, who's what's true. And they kind of play both because she stabs him, right? And you mentioned that she stabs him and then he starts laughing. So all of a sudden it's oh, he's not in pain. And she says, see, no pain. He must be a dibuk. Right. But then almost as she says that, he says, look, I'm actually starting to feel sort of lighthearted. And he opens his shirt and you see the blood kind of pooling out from the wound. And it's definitely playing on both sides. Mm-hmm. I think that it's establishing just a lot of this sort of uncertainty, this look for answers. Off the bat, they're teasing their audience. We're supposed to be an analog for Larry, I think, throughout the film, but just not only the question of, was he a dibuk? What's going on here? What was the right thing to do? What did, God want? Which is, a big part of it. But even the meta question you just said of what does this have to do with the movie? How does this play? And is this the key to unlocking all the mysteries, the unresolved mysteries of the movie? Or is this just a teaser up front? I wanted to share before passing it back to you, just one piece of trivia that I read, on our go-to IMDb. And they said, it says the Coen brothers stated that the opening scene was nothing more than a little short that they made up to get the audience in the proper mood and that there is no meaning behind it. And that's something they said. I'm going to be on the record here and say I don't necessarily believe that, because I think that a lot of their stuff has intention. And I think their biggest philosophy with this movie is like trying to tell the audience not to overthink this stuff and not to try to figure it out. And that sometimes this happens. But I know that I believe that they were very intentional with it. And I think that there is this huge thematic connection of just questioning ourselves and wondering, what's real and what's not. And, if we're going crazy or if the world's going crazy. So I think it's all there in that first piece, but I just thought it was really funny how they kind of said, nope, it was just completely random. Stop trying to read meaning into our movie.
Yeah, I don't buy that. I mean, I think it's such an effective way to open the film. And it really, like you said, kind of makes you a little bit unsettled and not sure what's what and what's up and what's down. And I think that, like you said, that feeling continues throughout the film. Is this a good guy? Is this a bad guy? Is he right? Is he wrong? Is people all of a sudden dying? It happens multiple times in the film. So it's just maybe to prepare us for the rest of the film. And then immediately after, boom, like hard cut to the credits. A lot of the names in the cast were very, very Jewish, but we'll get to that, towards our end of our ranking. But I think, the tension builds throughout the film. And so we start out with Larry Gopnik, who is played by Michael Stuhlbarg, who I first came across as someone from Boardwalk Empire. And I just remember him in that role as being such a captivating actor. And I think this was his first sort of professional role as an actor. I think prior to this, he was a stage actor. And he's, living in Minnesota in the 1960s. And pretty early on, the plot is set in motion where his wife says that, he's having a hard time at work. His wife says she wants a divorce. He's up for tenure. And there's just a lot going on. His kids are buzzing around the house. It's just chaos. And it reminded me a lot of like Uncut Gems in a sense that there's just like so much tension going on a lot. And then there's familial distress.
Yeah, I'll jump in on the Uncut Gems thing that you mentioned, because one of the things we discussed with that movie, and I want to get this at the top because it's a big read of this movie, specifically A Serious Man in the Thread, is this comparison to the biblical text of Job, right? Who's this character that experiences a lot of suffering. And it's very much mirrored in the opening sequences you're talking about, where we have this character of Larry, and all of a sudden, all these bad things start happening to him at once, where he finds very out that his wife wants to divorce him, and then he's having trouble at school. And then, he's finding out he might not be up for tenure, right? In the very funny scene, this guy comes into his office and says,
Larry, I feel that as head of the tenure committee, I should tell you this, though it should be no cause for concern and you should not at all be worried. We've received a number of letters denigrating you and urging us not to grant you tenure.
From who?
Well, they're anonymous, so we dismiss them completely.
And I mentioned the connection to Uncut Gems because I think we had a similar read of that movie. If you go back to the tapes, anyone wants to look back at the older episode, we said it's a very sort of Job analog. And that read of this movie, specifically A Serious Man, is very, very interesting because, the Job story, he has a lot of these things that he experiences, all of these like terrible things happen to him. And he's this, really, really righteous and upstanding guy, Job, at least in that story. And, God is kind of testing him and giving him all this stuff and all of it's happening bad to him. But ultimately he like really pushes back, challenges God, kind of like connects in a very clear and focused way. And that kind of all works out. And I read a lot of comparisons to this movie where the Jobness of all the bad things happening to Larry is certainly there, but the way that Larry kind of meets them and his, not so much a focused, retort to God, but really just this confusion and this questioning and this kind of shrinking away is where those two texts really, really depart. And, you kind of see that already when his wife tells him about, that she wants to get married to this man, Cy Abelman. He kind of like just acts confused and shies away. There's no fight. There's no, whatever, trying to like push back for himself. So, and we'll carry that throughout the rest of the movie because a lot of that kind of coexists there. Yeah,
definitely. The response to this trauma is definitely more flight than fight, I would say. And I think,
for sure,
as things pile up with him, it gets more intense and more intense. And it's very clear that he can't handle it. As you mentioned before, he's up for tenure. A student comes in and wants to change his grade. He tries to bribe him. He passes, money in an envelope, which will become like a plot device later in the film. But we're also introduced to other family members in Larry's household. We have his son, Danny, who's preparing for his bar mitzvah, smoking a lot of pot, practicing for his bar mitzvah using records. His daughter is constantly going out to the hole. I think this is maybe like a salon or a club or something like that. And she's, saving up money for a nose job. So there's a lot of familiar stuff. The wife is sort of one-dimensional. She doesn't really have much of a role in this film other than being like a plot device as well, which I thought was interesting considering like the Jewish mother, the Jewish matriarch is such a strong piece of this, of at least Jewish culture, I guess I would say. But yeah, I think, the wife, like you said, Harry, is interested in continuing her relationship with Cy Abelman, who's a very like mellow dude, and comparing him with Larry is kind of interesting. There's more comparisons to them later on, even to the point where Larry says to a rabbi that he's seeing,
"Did I tell you I had a car accident the same time Cy had his? The same instant, for all I know. Is Hashem trying to tell me that Cy Abelman is me? Or that we are all one or something?"
Cy Abelman and a lot of the characters around Larry are kind of just living with this uncertainty in a way that they're very able to just kind of go on with their lives and live with it and be kind of mellow about it. And as Larry kind of increasingly asks these questions and gets, just confused and he's like, why is this all happening? It just feels like everyone else in his life is just very sort of hyper focused on what they're doing and their own lives, that they just sort of fail to, see his own struggles and also just, question in the same way that he is. And and I want to build to it before we get into it, but this mirrors, I think, something similar that happens when he meets the second rabbi, because we haven't gotten to this, but eventually, with all these uncertain things happening in his life, Larry kind of successfully goes to a couple of different rabbis to get some answers.
Right.
But before we get to that,
yeah, don't spoil it too soon. Spoiler alert. I think what might be helpful to like frame this discussion is thinking about Larry and how he relates to Cy Abelman, and then also how he relates to his son, Danny. So one thing that I was thinking about is like, Danny is preparing for his bar mitzvah, and that's very stressful. And he deals with it in a certain way, maybe by medicating with marijuana. And Larry is also sort of preparing, so to speak, with his tenure. And how does he medicate and how does he cope with the stress? And how does Cy deal with all this stuff? He just kind of like, gives a hug and goes plays golf and is very, at least on the surface. We don't really get into Cy's mind.
On the surface, but I do think that later on in the movie, there are some reveals about what he's kind of been doing in the shadows that, we'll get to it. But he has more going on than at least he purports, this sort of sense of just come in and give a hug. There's no animosity here. I'm not upset with you, Larry. We don't need a fight. But, obviously there's more going on there, as we'll see later on in the movie.
Yeah, he's a bit of a wolf in sheep's clothing, I think. We're also introduced to Uncle Arthur, who's played by Richard Kind, and that's Larry's brother. He's a bit of a mysterious character at first. He's constantly draining his sebaceous cyst in the back of his neck and drawing in the Mentaculus, which is his little book that sort of organizes the world into a series of patterns and a lot of like mathematical things we see, and then also like the names of God. I read about the Mentaculus that this was something that the Coen brothers pulled from their real life, that they knew someone who had something like this, like a Mentaculus. So they kind of worked that into the story. But this is something that Arthur is working on throughout the film. And he's like a very curious character. And just as you said with Cy, as the film progresses, we find out more and more about them. But yeah, I just wanted to call him out as well. I wanted to set the table a bit before we get started and eat dinner,
Arthur, I think, is a fascinating character. And this Mentaculus, right? He calls it a probability map of the universe. Arthur ends up becoming a really good analog to, I think, Larry's same kind of struggles with trying to understand and make sense of the universe. And this all fits in thematically. But, obviously we're talking about all this uncertainty that Larry encounters and all of these bad things kind of happening to him. And, one of the reasons he struggles so much with actually processing it and making sense of it is because he says it a couple times in the film, but he is a very, rational man. And he thinks of things that there are numerous conversations. I wrote some down, but he just talks about how, like things like there is a cause and effect for things, and things do follow the structure. I think a lot of it comes up in his conversation with the student that's trying to bribe him, where he tells him, he's like, no, like actions do have consequences and there is a reason. And the student's trying to make the case for, no, it's okay. Just take the money and like, give me a good grade.
I know for sure that Clive, during their initial conversation, speaks in a way, you know, the wording that he chooses is very mysterious and kind of not exactly what you'd expect from a high school student. But I also feel like the fact that, you know, Larry is like a physics professor, and so everything is very logical. Like the fact that his world is illogical and things are coming out of nowhere and have no reason and no precedent, and it's just happening all of a sudden, to him is very hard to square in with his sort of physics background.
Exactly. And that's kind of what I was getting at with his brother, where it's just like he has this sort of probability map of the universe. And that's exactly how Larry thinks about the universe, that there is a clear answer. You know, I think one of the funny and sort of telling threads that we see in the movie is he's obviously this physics teacher, like you mentioned, and he teaches like some concepts that are sort of premised on uncertainty. You know, one of them we see very early in the film, actually, one of the first scenes is he's teaching about Schrodinger's cat, and you know, talks about how like it's just, you know, the case of, I'm not going to go into the science of Schrodinger's cat and just kind of rely on people knowing it, but the basic thing is that, you know, there's it, like he uses that as an example to explain this sort of quantum physical phenomenon where you can't tell where a certain particle is based on, you know, without probing it, but probing it kind of moves the particle. But the idea that, you know, with the Schrodinger's cat is that, you know, the sort of the metaphor or the parable, which, you know, I know we mentioned at the top, there's that, you know, parabolic story. And I'm going to make this case throughout. I think a lot of the messaging that, you know, that Larry receives is framed in a parable, but Larry doesn't like the parable. But the Schrodinger's cat parable, just to get into what he actually teaches, it's that there's this cat in a box and you don't know that if it's alive or dead, and the act of opening the box, I think, will, you know, kill the cat. And again, if there's someone who understands this physics better than me, we have, you know, reach out to us on Instagram, explain to me why I'm wrong or why I didn't go into enough detail, because I'm sure I'm missing something. But it just creates the situation of uncertainty, because you can never know the status of the cat, because it's sort of both alive and dead, because you can never actually know. So you have to treat it like it's alive and dead. And once you check it, you know, whatever. Again, I'm going to end the segment of like Harry's physics corner, because that's as far as I'm going to get here. But what's so interesting about it is that it grapples with this uncertainty. And when he meets with the student, right, the student tells him, like, I understand the physics, I know the cat story, but the student says, but I just don't know the math. And Larry's like, no, but the math is the thing. Like the math makes sense. The math is what what sort of solves itself. And he even says, like, I don't even like care. He goes, I don't even get the cat story so much. I just get the math. Like, you know, that's what Larry says. And it's just so telling that he's just like, I can't deal with this sort of parable layer, this sort of story layer that we use to try to understand the science. I deal very explicitly in like the numbers, in math, and the things working out. And that's why throughout the movie, and as we touch on some of the later scenes, you know, and he's dealt with a lot of cryptic messaging and a lot of, you know, parable messaging, a lot of story, you know, versions trying to explain to him what's going on. He can't take any of these answers. Larry's a rational man. He wants to understand what's going on. And, you know, that sort of clean cut explanation never really does come.
Yeah. You know, I think what's also interesting about what you're saying with what he understands versus what everyone else understands throughout his classroom scenes, where he's like doodling on the chalkboard and explaining all the facts and the figures and the this, that, and the other. And then we zoom out and it's like 18 chalkboards with all this sort of like physics scribble. And then he like sort of, I think he pauses for questions, or like people are getting dismissed and like no one says anything. And he's like, and this is the uncertainty principle or something like that. And it just goes to show you how he sees the world versus how the world sort of exists. And like in his mind, everything sort of makes sense as far as like the stuff that he's written out on the chalkboard, but no one really seems to understand what's going on.
And no one, and I think back to our other point, I think no one seems to care. You know, that's why there are characters like Cy Abelman, like his wife, that are just like, yeah, we can't do all the math, solve out the explanation of the world, but they're almost comfortable with the uncertainty. And I think that's true for basically every other character. I can't think of anyone who's as plagued. I guess maybe his brother, right? Because he has that scene later on where he's also struggling with, you know, what God has given him. But, you know, no one else is really as bogged down in the actual math of it. They just want the stories. They just want, you know, to know everything's going to be okay, and to kind of, you know, ignorance is bliss to a certain extent.
You know, after he's approached by Clive, who wants to bribe him. So Cy and Judith, his wife, he moves to the Jolly Roger after this very uncomfortable conversation over lunch. The way that they sort of phrase it is,
this is an issue where no one is at odds.
Living arrangements?
I think we all agree that the children not being contaminated with the tension, the most important.
We shouldn't put the kids in the middle of this, Larry.
Kids aren't.
I'm saying we. I'm not pointing fingers.
No one is playing the blame game now.
I didn't say anyone was.
Well, let's not play he said, she said either.
I wasn't.
All right, look. Let's just take a step back and we can diffuse the situation.
Really, to keep things on an even keel leading up to Danny's bar mitzvah.
Child's bar mitzvah.
Cy and I think it's best if you move out of the house.
he's just sort of flummoxed and doesn't understand what's going on. So he moves into this Jolly Roger apartment or this motel with his brother. And he seems to have like these fever dreams during his stay at the Jolly Roger. And I wanted to touch on that really quickly. He has these very like scary dreams, Cy Abelman pinning him up against his chalkboard and bashing his face in, using all these expletives about his wife. And then he has a dream about his neighbor, Mrs. Samsky, who he saw nude sunbathing. He dreams about her later. And then the last dream, which we'll get into a little bit more, but it's featuring his neighbors. So the neighbors, we got to talk about that for a second. They are the only sort of non-Jewish presence in the film. And the neighbors are, constantly playing ball with each other, playing catch. Turns out that the neighbors are like mowing part of his lawn, which is kind of an annoying thing for him. And then they go hunting as well. But I want to get your thoughts on like the neighbors who are not Jewish. They call them the Goyish neighbors. What do they represent for you?
Yeah, like in some sense, I think they represent a very different sort of lifestyle. And we talk about, these sort of Jewish, these Jewish conceptions of the sort of like, the people of the book, and these very sort of textual and this very, overthinking and that kind of characterization of, a Jewish character. And it felt to me like, his neighbor, the sort of Goyish neighbor, kind of stands in very stark contrast with that. They're these very, tough, intimidating guys, very kind of quiet, like men of, a couple of words, right? He first interacts with, the sort of his neighbor and then his neighbor's son, who are out for the day because they went hunting for the day. And Larry even makes a comment. He says,
"Isn't this a school day?"
Took him out of school today so he could hunt with his dad.
Just like very matter of fact and very much not bogged down in the intricacies and the intellectualism and that, right. I think in that sort of like people of the book, like studying, it's much more, outdoorsy. It's much more, doing things with your hands. I think it was supposed to be, stark contrast and a different mode of what we've been describing a lot of these periphery characters as being people who, aren't bogged down in the big questions of life and aren't overthinking things. Each of them kind of has their own thing that preoccupies them. So for the sake of his neighbor, I think it's just, they're out hunting, they're doing their own thing. And I think Larry, specifically in their case, just can't understand that, doesn't know why this guy took his son out of school. And just doesn't understand, how to interact with him when he tries to fight him over like the property line. There's this clear disconnect and Larry kind of shies away from it.
Yeah, it's interesting with the property line, like we were mentioning. I think there's one chat where Larry sees that his neighbor is going to build a shed, and it's sort of on the poplar line. And Larry comes in with this sort of long sort of discussion about the property line, but doesn't really get it out because he's sort of mumbling and fumbling. And as you said, the neighbor is like a man of few words. He says,
"Measure."
I don't have to measure. You can tell. It's
Lines of poplar.
The poplar being like the tree that's right in front of them. And like you said, man of few words, very simplistic, not overthinking things. But yeah, I think that's a good call out. And the neighbors even show up in a dream. Larry later on in the film is giving his brother money and sending him away to Canada. And as he's sort of floating away on this canoe in a lake, they're shot by the hunter. The brother is shot in the back of the head by the hunters. After Cy and Judith and Larry, meet up, Larry moves into the Jolly Roger with his brother, Arthur. He finds out after retaining a lawyer that his wife, Judith, has emptied his bank accounts. And so then he retains a divorce lawyer, but also a lawyer to look into property lines. And he definitely has a crisis of faith at this point. And I forget who, maybe it's either Cy or his brother, Arthur, who suggests that he kind of looks looks inside and looks for some faith. Oh, I think it's actually when he's playing on the beach with Arthur's in the water and his son's playing in the water and things like that. And someone actually suggests,
it's not always easy deciphering what God is trying to tell you, but it's not something you have to figure out all by yourself. We're Jews. We've got that well of tradition to draw on to help us understand. When we're puzzled, we have all the stories that have been handed down from people who had the same problems.
She's instantly coming to him with this sort of like, and I think this is rooted in a lot of Jewish Talmudic tradition. We have, with Midrash, this collection of these different like stories, these parables that are used to kind of tell, greater truths, highlight greater stories, and maybe not the most explicit way. And we already spoke about how, Larry is this very rational person, and it's very hard for him to get on, that wavelength of translating a very vague and esoteric story. But, it's very cool here that she points out that, that is our tradition. We use the stories of the people that happened before us to guide our future. And that kind of sends him on this reluctant path, I would say, to, talk to the rabbi, because she says, talk to the rabbi. And he says, what would he say? And she says, if I knew, I would be the rabbi, but I'm not. So you got to go talk to them. So that sets up the first of his 3 encounters with different rabbis in the community.
Yeah. So first he meets up with Rabbi Scott, who's a junior rabbi played by Simon Helberg. But I believe he wanted to see Rabbi Nachner, who's played by George Weiner from Spaceballs fame and other movies. And ultimately there's a third rabbi, Rabbi Marshak, but we'll get to him in a second. The first rabbi, the junior rabbi, Scott, he's very, very cool looking rabbi, short sleeved, white button up shirt, nice skinny tie, very much a man of the people, man of the community. And, they talk to each other, and
you have to see these things as expressions of God's will. You don't have to like it, of course.
The boss isn't always right, but he's always the boss.
That's right. Things aren't so bad. Look at the parking lot, Larry.
This first rabbi basically tells him, his solution to these questions of what's going on, why is everything, so terrible? And he kind of guides him in this mode of, it's all about perspective. And he's like, if you just think of it as, you're thinking of these questions, why are all these bad things happening to me? But if you really change your perspective and realize, what good God has given you and how that's manifesting, you'll be happy. And he makes this big point of looking out the window and he says, look at that parking lot. How incredible is that? God created that. It's amazing. And they don't just say God, they say Hashem, which obviously is how we refer to God in Judaism. And that's just another deep cut that, I think we mentioned this in another movie that says Hashem. Maybe it was Uncut Gems, which might honestly be cousins with this movies in some ways. But if a movie's going to throw in Hashem, then it's already getting an extra star for me. But anyways, he does this big rant where he says, just have a good perspective. And it's this very youthful, like, if you're thinking about this wrong. And for a moment, I think Larry actually is moved by this. There's a later scene where I forget who he's meeting with, but, he says to him, like, how are things going? And he's like, good. Like, yeah, I'm getting divorced, but I think it's opening me up to what I really have and showing me new opportunities. It's when he's meeting his lawyer that Larry kind of responds like that. And his lawyer looks at him quizzically, like, really? Do you really think that? And Larry goes, I don't know. I'm not sure. And
he's trying it on,
He's trying on this perspective thing, but it's definitely not sticking, I think, as hard, as he needs it to.
Absolutely. After meeting with the first rabbi, who's sort of the junior and not exactly who he had planned to meet up with initially, he then meets up with Rabbi Nachner, who's our second rabbi. And similar to, the beginning of the movie where we have this really nice parable, he tells the second rabbi, Rabbi Nachner, while dipping, his tea in his mug and sort of the whole scene, I think, was just kind of interesting. He tells a very interesting story of another congregant of his who is a dentist. And one day he's inspecting someone's teeth who is a non-Jew, and he has the Hebrew letters on the inside of his teeth that spell out the word Hoshieni, which is save me. And he thought he was going crazy. So then he goes and checks everyone else's teeth, and he checks again and it's still there. He checks his own teeth and this and that. And there's a very long story that Rabbi Nachner tells. And then we cut back to both of them sitting in his office, and he says,
who put it there? Was it for him, Sussman, or for whoever found it, or for just for
We can't know everything.
It sounds like you don't know anything. Why even tell me the story?
First I should tell you, then I shouldn't. These questions that are bothering you, Larry.
Maybe they're like a toothache. Feel them for a while, then they go away.
I don't want it to just go away. I want an answer.
Sure, we all want the answer. Hashem doesn't owe us the answer, Larry. Hashem doesn't owe us anything. The obligation runs the other way.
Why does he make us feel the questions if he's not going to give us any answers?
And so at that point, Larry's a little bit confused, but I wanted to get your thoughts on this story and sort of, it's a very bizarre story and it kind of thematically fits, but it's also like a bit mysterious and kind of supernatural. It's a bit not grounded, whereas everything else is fairly grounded.
Totally. It's very supernatural. I agree with you, which kind of lends it to the realm of, the sort of midrash that I just mentioned, which, at the risk of sounding like a broken record, this is probably the most explicit, parable that is sort of used to solve his story. Whereas, the first rabbi at least tried to give him some, sound advice, change your perspective, think about it a different way. And even if that wasn't enough for Larry, at least it was clear and I would say rational, right? To the point that Larry should be able to understand. But this one was clearly just like this very mystical story of, that kind of resolves itself, not in any answers to the question, but almost in more questions, in that sort of very roundabout and I would say Jewish, midrashic way of just, like, he's like, what is it? Like you said, the rabbi goes, what does it matter? What happened? Why does it matter? So Larry actually asks him, he says, okay, but based on this experience, right? Because the dentist was looking for all these teeth. He was trying to make meaning out of it and eventually came to the same rabbi to say, what's going on here? What does God want from me? Does God want me to, save this goy, right? This person whose teeth he was cleaning? Does he want me to save like myself? Like, what is the point of this? And so Larry asks the rabbi, he says, so what did you say to him when he asked you all that? And he says, I told him, I don't know, we can't know what God wants, but do good things to other people because, what like that can't hurt, right? It's nice to do some good things. But it's just, it's like such a perfect, you see it on Larry's face, I think, after he's met with that answer, because this is so not what he was looking for. He wanted certainty. He wanted an answer. He wanted to know, like he believes in this very moral like ruling of the world. It seems like his relationship with, God, his Jewishness is predicated on this notion of if he does good things, if he does good will happen to him. And he's expecting, and like we said at the top, he's not like this Job character. He's not this extremely righteous figure who is doing everything right from the outset. We kind of see him, he's sort of morally gray. He doesn't accept the bribe in the beginning. We see some cracks though. Right. Exactly. He has he's not always the best, with his family and not the most present. And he's clearly, kind of just like a normal guy, but it's still, he doesn't expect all the terrible things that are happening to him. He doesn't understand how that could be and why that's all happening to him. And, this encounter, I would say, leaves him almost more confused than maybe when he started, because it's just an answer of, who knows? It's not right. I think the rabbi says it's not for, God doesn't owe us anything. In fact, it goes the other way. We owe God something. So stop asking questions and just embrace being a good Jew.
Right. So we forgot to mention that before seeing Rabbi Nachner, Cy Abelman unexpectedly dies in a car accident. And this is around the same time that Larry also gets into a car accident at the same moment. In fact, the movie takes pains to cross-cut the two scenes together. And I almost thought for a second that Larry was going to hit Cy or Cy was going to hit Larry and something like that. But it turns out that Cy Abelman passes away and Larry is welcomed back in the house to help his wife, cope with the grief that she's had. It's a very awkward situation where he's put in a very awkward situation, but like you said, he's taking it with stride for now. I think eventually, as we said, he's showing his cracks, and so he's starting to break a little bit.
Right. And he even pays for Cy's funeral, right? Judith, his wife, insists that he pays for it. So he's in this place of yeah. And he's just like, what is going on? Why am I doing any of this? And that's kind of the reason that he even he goes to the second rabbi, because, the answer from the first rabbi of just sort of taking on a new perspective, it doesn't really work when something as seemingly, mystical and just, coincidental, I'd say, happens like that happens with this, with Cy dying. And he says, like, is this a good thing? Like, does this mean that things are going to go back to normal? Do I want them to go back to normal? It just sets up a whole new set of questions that, he didn't have before.
Right. So one day while fixing up his son's TV antenna, I don't know, for those who are not familiar, TV used to come over the airwaves, and so you'd have to fix the aerial. This is a lesson. A lesson for Harry. His son Danny is kind of, while watching, while listening to his bar mitzvah lessons and smoking pot, one of his pastimes is watching a show called F Troop. So he's constantly nagging his dad to fix the aerial. In fact, I think he calls him either at the lawyer's office. Yeah, I think he calls him at the lawyer's office to say, fix the aerial, meaning fix the antenna on top of the roof. So he goes up on the roof and he sees his neighbor, Mrs. Samsky, played by Amy Landecker. She's sunbathing nude, and he kind of, watches her for a little bit. And I think later on he gets the idea to go over to her house and sort of, after his life has seemingly hit rock bottom at this point, he goes over and sort of sees what could happen. And he goes over, I saw a great video where it talks about her being this sort of woman of mystery. She's got this like smoky eye and like sort of Egyptian makeup, and she's behind a screen door, but she kind of lets him in and is very mysterious, but also a Jew. She's got a mezuzah on the door, and he goes in and they play records together. She offers him some iced tea, and she smokes a joint with him. And that kind of like opens up his perspective a little bit and kind of makes him see the world maybe like to what Rabbi Scott was saying, with a little bit of wonder, with a brand new perspective. And I think, throughout this film, there's a lot of subplots we're not really touching on. Danny has his bar mitzvah also while stoned. So the two experiences are kind of similar. Danny's going through this very like moving, this very momentous occasion while under the influence, and has the sort of same view as his dad, where like the edges of the frame are blurry and the center is focused, and you think he's going to choke, but eventually he succeeds and does very well. And while, Larry is trying to see the third rabbi, Rabbi Marshak, Larry's not able to. There's a very comic scene where he talks to the secretary, who like sort of putters to the back. The rabbi's sort of sitting at a desk, and then she putters back and she says he's busy. And he doesn't quite understand what's going on. But after Danny is bar mitzvahed, he does in fact get to see Rabbi Marshak, who gives him back his confiscated Walkman and quotes Jefferson Airplane to him. And that is sort of his piece of wisdom, which again is very like in fitting with the theme of like the rabbis. Like the first rabbi is very approachable advice. The second rabbi, a little bit more esoteric. And then third rabbi is quoting some song.
Then the truth is found to be lies, and all the hope within you dies.
Which makes no sense at all. Your thoughts on Rabbi Marshak and his advice to Danny as a young bar mitzvah boy?
Yeah, I think that advice, it's, there's two ways to read it. There's the version of just sort of getting roped into the sort of trap that I think Larry's struggling with, of just trying to parse out meaning and find your answers. And, like you mentioned, he quotes the song that we've heard Danny listening to, on this Walkman. So it seems like the rabbi has listened to it. And, I wrote down some of the lines. It's, when the truth is found to be lies and all hope within you dies, then what? And, on one end, I think one reading of it is just like, he's quoting the song back to him. It's supposed to sound cryptic. Does it actually mean anything? Depends if you wanted to, right? If you wanted to, then, the truth is found to be lies. The hope within you dies. I mean, that honestly does parallel a lot of Larry's experience, that he's become hopeless and everything he's known to be true. This whole sense of, right and wrong in the world, this sense of, morality and justice for, good actions. It's found to be lies. And, what are you supposed to do? And then when he hands the Walkman back to Danny, he kind of just says, be a good boy. And it almost feels like there's, on one end, there's this very cryptic, maybe layered meaning about what to do when nothing goes how you're expecting it and everything is challenged and whatever. And on the other end, it's just, there's a lot of distraction. Just be a good boy. It's the one thing that we know we could do. It's the one thing we can control. It's the one thing we can focus on. And maybe that's the answer that he's needed all along, that, Larry doesn't even receive, right? It goes to his son, who I doubt is going to really share it with Larry. But, that's kind of that's just the be all end all. Just be a good boy.
Right. Exactly.
What did you think of it?
I mean, I thought it was interesting, kind of anticlimactic. I would love to have seen a scene between Larry and Rabbi Marshak But I think that's sort of the point, right? Like everyone's sort of expecting that sort of to happen and it doesn't, keeping with the theme of like, you think you have everything settled? Well, we're going to flip your expectations upside down. After Danny sees Rabbi Marshak, we then see Larry meeting up with his divorce lawyer and another lawyer to talk about his brother's case, his property stuff going on with his neighbor, and then also with, his wife. And out of the blue, out of nowhere, the partner lawyer dies just from a heart attack, collapses. That leaves Larry a bit more shocked. He heads back to his office after having just seen a death. He gets another phone call from the record company who's been hounding him this entire time. I think it's a predecessor to like the Columbia House record, a setup where they send you a record of the month and they charge him money. He has no idea what's going on. This is the first he's heard of it. He's sort of beside himself, having just witnessed a death. I think if we're talking about body count, this is the second one of the film. This is definitely where things start cracking a bit more.
This also happens after, I think, things started to kind of be righted in his life. Like all of a sudden, the bar mitzvah sequence we spoke about earlier, where, his son Danny is like, seems like he's going to fail, and then kind of has the successful bar mitzvah. Like you said, the entire time you're waiting for something to happen. He was, sitting there high. I'm waiting for him to trip over or pass out or something, or, vomit all over the Torah, which is a story that I have heard has happened before in the past. But yeah, but like you're expecting something bad to happen, but then it happens, it's good. And then, his wife Judith looks at him and they kind of at Larry and they hold hands and they're kind of proud of, their son together. And it's their first genuine moment. And, that's undercut a little bit because that's when Judith says to Larry that she's like, Cy really respected you. He wrote a lot of letters to the tenure committee on your behalf.
Ooh, yeah.
And it kind of cracks in. We mentioned this earlier that Cy seems like this all nice character, but one of the threads we didn't touch on in the movie is that the entire time Larry is being told that someone keeps writing these anonymously written, but like, kind of letters basically denigrating him and saying that he's a bad teacher and kind of telling them not to give him tenure. And the professor who tells him that is just, I just wanted to let you know, we're not going to consider them, but you should know that someone keeps sending these letters. And so that kind of undercuts, I would say, the joy.
And he does point out that these letters are written by somebody who is a native English speaker. So we kind of quickly rule out that it is not Clive, our South Korean student, who is giving him trouble and bribing.
Exactly. That helps us piece together that it must have been Cy. So that kind of revelation definitely undercuts a little bit more of the joy at the end. But there definitely is this moment towards the end of the film, right before some of these like final scenes, right before, like you're saying, the scene where the lawyer dies, where it feels like, okay, the bar mitzvah went well. He's kind of moving in again because Cy is out of the picture and he's getting along with his brother Arthur. And all of a sudden it feels like maybe he was just struggling just for things to be good again. That's back to the story that we highlighted at the top, right? The sort of analog we mentioned to the biblical story of Job. That is what happens a lot in the text of Job. After, chapters and chapters of Job's suffering, eventually he is rewarded kind of like twice. I think it's like twice-fold or something for, what he had before. And, it's a kind of, he loses all of his possessions and in that story, he loses a lot of his family, but then he's given, new possessions and an even larger family, twice as many kids as he had, and just, which is a complicated trade-off that we're not going to get into now, but there's just this like real happy ending. I saw an article referred to the story of Job as having more of a cinematic ending, but that's not quite what we're going to get from, a serious man. Although for a moment, it almost seems like maybe his family's coming together. Maybe he's going to do well. He's about to get tenure. Maybe things are going to be, good for him. But, then when I think that scene you just mentioned where the lawyer dies, that kind of sends him into shock again. Like just when he thought things were going to be normal again, the lawyer, who was the really great lawyer that was going to defend him and get him out of trouble, dies in front of him, which is admittedly pretty jarring.
Absolutely. We've mentioned throughout the latter part of the film, as he's staying at the Jolly Roger Motel with his brother Arthur, he has a series of sort of what I would call fever dreams. They don't introduce them as dreams, or they sort of end each of those dreams with him kind of like waking up in shock. And so, his first dream is about Cy Abelman, while in the classroom, sort of beating him up, smashing him up against the chalkboard. His second dream is after he meets Mrs. Samsky, and they do have sex in the dream.
They start having sex, but like all these dreams that kind of end very shockingly and suddenly, all of a sudden he starts to see Cy Abelman standing over him, putting the boards of a of a coffin on top of him and kind of sealing him in, and that kind of jolts him awake. So, all these dreams kind of end in a sort of sudden and shocking, ending to what otherwise would have been a sweet moment, which is just like the third dream, right?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. So the third dream is with his brother Arthur as he's sending him off. They're driving up a road and they stumble upon a lake, seemingly in Canada, according to a sign.
Right. It's like by the border. He's sending him to Canada to evade the police that are trying to get him.
And, as a way to save his brother from the police, who was also caught gambling. So he's been in a number of run-ins with the law, and it's best that he sends him off. So he puts him in a canoe, sends him off, has a envelope full of money that he has had throughout the film, from his student that he has not used up until this point. He gives it to his brother and sends him off with that money. And as he's paddling away, he is shot by his hunter neighbors. And I think, the dreams are analyzing or commenting on certain aspects of his life. I think the last dream for me, working backwards, would be like, maybe the fact that he's sort of embracing this amorality with taking the money has caused him to have those closest to him die. But curious on your thoughts about the dreams. They were all like pretty shocking dreams, and they, served a good purpose to sort of put the viewer at unease and definitely put Larry at unease. But your thoughts on the dreams?
Yeah, I like that read of the amoral thing, because even in the second dream, we were talking about, having sex with his neighbor. We know that his neighbor's married. She mentions that her husband is, he goes out, he just goes traveling a lot and, presumably on business. So, the concept of the notion of him going over when he's not home and having sex with her, sort of cheating on her husband, like that's another amoral act. And it's born out of this desire that comes from this place of Larry's entire life crumbles around him. And, he's already thinking about this when, Cy is still alive, but Cy is, going with, his wife Judith, and they're kind of, like leaving him to rot. And he's got into this place where he's almost tempted. And he's like, maybe I don't have to be the sort of upstanding Jew that, I needed to be. And it's funny, in both those later two dreams, once he starts flirting with doing something amoral, something really bad happens to him. And I think that represents, these are dreams, right? So of course that represents part of his subconscious kind of dealing with, this temptation and the sort of morality crisis that I think he has. And, part of it, I think, is just the confusion and the meaning that we try to get out of these very sudden dreams. Like you said, this is very sort of sudden and very dramatic and ropes you in. And, do you think that do you think the Coen brothers, or intention aside, but do you think we're supposed to, get strict meaning from these and tie these to the rest of the film? Or did you read them more as just these, these confusing, again, to repeat myself, but just more parables to kind of give us a different version of the same story that we're watching?
I mean, I think it's in sticking with the theme of this being like a Jewish film and having like biblical allusions and things like that. There's a lot of characters throughout the Bible that have had dreams directly or indirectly inform their fate or things that they were thinking about. So dreams have like a long tradition, as with all cultures. I think the dream device kind of helps get into the mind of the character, literally, like knowing what they're thinking. And they don't necessarily like inform his decisions all the time, but it certainly lets the viewer get into their headspace in a way that I think is much more visceral than saying, boy, I'm really thinking about Cy Abelman a lot, or I'm thinking about Mrs. Zamsky a lot, or my brother, or things like that. I think it's a stylistic choice, and I think it works well. But, as we kind of round the corner and get to the end of the film, I think, after seeing all this stuff happen and Larry being where he is just mentally, he decides to go back to his office. He opens up his drawer. He sees like a $3,000 bill from the lawyer. And then he kind of looks at the money a second time and maybe decides that this is something he could use. And then also, so he changes that student's grade from an F to a C, but then puts that minus on there as like a little, I'm not giving you a full pass, but I'm going to be able to have a little bit of agency in my life. And then also his doctor calls with some serious test results that he really wants to talk to him in person about. And we're cross-cutting that scene with Danny, who's in Hebrew school, and there's a tornado going on. So they're trying to open the door to get to the bomb shelter, or to get to the shelter downstairs as a tornado closes in. And that's sort of where the movie ends. None of these scenes resolve. We have no idea what's going on. But the end credits happen there, and I'm just like, what? What's going on? Like, this is certainly in keeping with the theme of the film. I thought this was an interesting way to end the film. But how did you feel about the end?
Yeah, I think it's another great tease from the directors, from the Coen brothers, where, you know, we finally have this moment. This guy that, like we said, is not the most upstanding guy, Larry, not the worst guy in the world, but has been in this very morally gray area. And it's kind of like a Chekhov's gun situation where we were introduced to this a Chekhov's gun situation. Chekhov gun, you know, he famously said, you can again look this up if you want to get the actual details of this, but he was this playwright who basically said that, you know, if you introduce a weapon in the first act of a film, it has to be fired by the third act of the film, right? A gun. So I'm just referring to this money as a sort of Chekhov's gun, where he kind of gets this bribe from the student, refuses to take it, but doesn't really get rid of it, kind of just slips it into his desk. And we saw in the dream sequence, he thought about giving it to Arthur to kind of send him on his way. But finally, he's like, after he's hit his breaking point, this scene comes immediately after the lawyer dies in front of him. And he's just like, nothing in the world makes sense. And that's kind of his breaking point, where he says, I'm just going to take the money. I need it to pay for this new bill that I got. And he takes the money and he makes this decision, and he kind of smiles. He gives, like you said, the C- instead of the F. And it's like, if what he learned from the movie is that nothing really matters, and, you know, there's nothing, you know, we're not rewarded for good behavior, we're not punished for bad behavior, I can do what I want. This feels like his moment of, I'm just going to take advantage and I'm going to do something that's, you know, a little bit amoral. And what's such a tease, I think, from the directors from the movie is that all of a sudden things start to get really, really bad almost as soon as that happens. He gets a phone call right away from a doctor who says, you know, you're going to have to come in to discuss this, the findings from your x-ray. And Larry even says, like, can't we just talk about it over the phone? And the doctor says, no, I think this would be a better conversation in person. So, you know, it's bad. And then, you know, their entire community is about to be threatened by this huge tornado. And it's a tornado, I think is awesome, because it's the first, like, obviously tornadoes are natural, but this sort of sudden tornado feels like a very supernatural, like smiting from God, you know,
exactly.
Himself. It's like he finally does this action. And then all of a sudden it's like, you know, you weren't rewarded for any of the good behavior you thought you were doing, but the first time you do this very explicitly bad action, it's like, boom, because you think that there are no real consequences to your actions. Finally, it's like, maybe there was meaning all the time. And I think it's another tease by the Coen brothers. And I think the truth is maybe this was just a series of coincidences and we just don't know what God wants. And that, you know, these sort of plans are very ambiguous and up in the air, but this kind of final tease of like, okay, we're going to put some, you know, sort of causative action, you know, following what he did is just, I just think it's like a perfect kind of ambiguous ending playing with the end. And like you said, we cut as the tornado is approaching. So you just never really learn, you know, what happens if they survive, if, you know, what ends up happening with these characters.
It's a perfect way to end the film. And another Chekhov's gun that I was thinking about is that we forgot to mention, I think one of the first scenes of the film is we see Larry getting x-rayed. And so like, it all gets kind of resolved at the last minute of the film, which is, like I said, a pretty cool way to end the film in keeping with the theme of just sort of chaos in a logical world for Larry. But let's take a quick break and we'll be right back to give our rating and review of the film, A Serious Man. We'll be right back.
Welcome back to Jews on Film. We've now arrived at the last section of our podcast where we go through the film's Jewishness in terms of its content, cast and crew, and themes, and just come up with a final ranking to describe, you know, how Jewish really was it, and then ask the follow-up question of, you know, good or bad for the Jews. So
thanks, Gil.
Daniel, thank you, Gil, for that recommendation. So, Daniel, why don't you get us started on this one? And I know there's a ton to tackle, so I'm really interested to hear sort of where you jump into this movie. But, you know, how did you think about its Jewishness? You know, you can go cast and crew. There's a lot of that. You can go content. There's a ton of that. You can go themes. I'd argue there's really a lot of that. So, you know, pick your battle. Where do you want to start?
I feel like I'm at a buffet and like all the stuff is really good stuff, but it's all very filling stuff. So I can't fill up on all of it. You know, like if you're
portion control,
it's portion control, but it's also not loading up too much on the proteins. You also have to like add some leafy greens because those are light but filling. So I'll try to pace myself a little bit.
I hope you follow this metaphor all the way through.
Oh, absolutely. You can count on it. The cast and crew is Jewish. The Coen brothers are Jewish. I think all of the main characters in my mind are Jewish, and they do a terrific job. I think it adds so much to the credibility of the film. The Hebrew teacher is, speaking Hebrew the entire time. The bus says Talmud Torah on it. Everyone who's speaking Hebrew and Yiddish seem to have it come out, at least in the film, as like their native tongue. So I would say very high for me on the cast and crew. The content itself, the story of what happens to him. There are a lot of like Jewish story arcs, seeing the rabbis, studying for a bar mitzvah, listening to a bar mitzvah lesson, going to Hebrew school. I was going to say there was not a service, but there is a service. There's a funeral service. There's Shiva sitting. Him being a professor at a university, one could argue is a Jewish pastime, a lot of liberal Jewish professors and things like that. That's a trope as well that we explore. So content, it's pretty Jewish as well. Themes is where I want to dig in, but I almost want to say this is dessert for you. So could we do the first two for you, and then we'll come back and we'll just do a discussion of the themes together? We'll have like a family style meal.
You kept to that metaphor. I appreciate it.
I told you I would.
In terms of pacing, that's clever. You just kind of whet the appetite a little bit. Some appetizers. It's almost like the prereqs before we can even discuss the themes. It's like, let's just acknowledge at the top, this is a fully Jewish cast and crew, more or less. I'm sure there are a couple people, but maybe not. And this is, very, very Jewish in its content wise. I'll agree with you and just say I was thinking about you a lot. I mean, first of all, in that opening scene, right? The Yiddish and just the characters and the accents. And as far as I could tell, as a non-native speaker, exactly. The attention to detail, the divik, the deep cuts, it was all there. I'll note that in those opening scenes, right, with I think one of the first scenes in the movie, we see Danny in a Hebrew class, and his teacher is talking in Hebrew. It's clearly like a Hebrew class because he's going through basic sort of like verb structure and sentence structure. And there were no subtitles. And I was just like, the amount of movies that I've seen that weren't subtitled, that have a scene in, a foreign language that's not necessarily Hebrew, because I am not a man of many languages. I am native English, and I have a pretty good understanding and ability to speak Hebrew, although don't test me on this pod because I might embarrass myself. But,
Harry. No problem.
So I have a little bit of an understanding of Hebrew, but just to be able to watch a movie, and a thing that I've noticed lots of movies do, where they kind of like flip languages and say it's not essential to the story. If if not, don't worry. And to just figure out what was going on, it was like, this was written with, from a Jewish perspective, a Jewish Hebrew speaking perspective. And, in some senses with that audience in mind, that if you'll get what's going on. So there's so much there. And just, the threads, like, I don't know if you ask someone what does it take for a movie to be Jewish, talking to a rabbi, there's plenty of scenes of those, like going to synagogue, praying, leaning from the Torah. I just, exactly. Like, I'm trying to think of, and I know that we have, I definitely have a sort of narrow, not a narrow scope of what it means to be Jewish, but I know my own experience. I don't know everyone's experience. And I'm sure there are facets that, were not touched by this movie, but it's hard for me to come up with it, because even though I don't think they were, they didn't practice their Judaism in exactly the same way that I did. There were so many familiar, sort of icons of the Jewish experience, and just even on the deeper levels of like the Jewish, characterization, and just who this guy Larry is. Like, if he was in any other movie, I think we would have read him maybe as a little bit coded Jewish and a little bit as like a Jewish character. So there is so much there in terms of the content and the creation. And, depending on where we get with this themes category, I think it's becoming a little bit clear where I'm about to go with my ranking. But before I do that, because we keyed it up and it sounds like you have some good ideas there. So I wanted to let you jump in with some of the themes that you were saving, the sort of main course that you were sitting on, and get us going.
So I actually prepared like a turducken of the main, the themes. Right. There's so much in here, and I think it's all sort of beautifully displayed, right? I think, this idea of like inherited trauma or inherited sort of baggage, I think about like original sin, this idea that like Eve ate from the apple and was tempted by the snake, and therefore women, some believe that they have to, have the sin, the pain of childbirth and things, that there's all these things because of what Eve did. So that So that is maybe a bit of I'm getting on the stretch train a little early today, but I thought about that, parable as it relates to Larry's life. And I think it's not completely a stretch to say, oh yeah, these are his ancestors who committed this grave sin. Again, a woman who committed a grave sin, and now Larry has to pay the price for it. I think the idea of this, seeing 3 different types of rabbis and getting 3 different types of advice, sort of goes to show you a couple things that, like, not all rabbis are the same. Not all rabbis may give you the answer you're looking for, and it's not like a magic bullet solution. So I think it's up to each person to kind of carve out their own lane as far as how they want to view the world, how they want to observe Judaism and things like that. And, I think about, like, what does it mean, this whole idea of a serious man? Sai talks about this a lot. What is a serious man? I don't know. Does it mean someone who takes his job seriously, who is serious religiously? I know we're like mid-meal on this themes part, but I wanted to jump in and say, like, Harry, what is a serious man to you?
A serious man, I think, we hear it in the movie because it's first referred to Sai. A couple people call him a serious man.
He was a serious man, yeah.
Exactly. And when he's having his funeral, the rabbi says he was a serious man.
Right,
and
right. What does that mean?
I kind of read it as, we were talking about the sort of the Job analog and the question of, is Larry a good man? Is he a bad man? And it's just, I don't think he's either, right? The serious man, is that a good thing? Are we supposed to be serious? Are we not? Like, how does that kind of weigh in? And how do you judge a serious man?
Right.
Because if this whole movie is a question of, how should Larry be judged, right? What kind of person was he? He definitely was someone who took things very seriously. Everyone around him was kind of just sort of accepting and laid back. He needed his answers. He was very rational. He was serious about things. He couldn't accept anything in a lighthearted and a relaxed and just sort of in the comforts of faith way. He needed his answers. So he's this serious man. And the question is, what does that make him? What does he get because of that? What does he deserve? And I don't know. All we know about him is he was serious. He took things seriously. Was that good? Was that bad? Like, did he deserve any of this? I don't know. He was a serious guy. That was kind of how I read it. Did you have a different kind of read on the title?
I mean, it's interesting. We talked before about in the second rabbi meetup, he says, they kind of play them against each other, Sai and Larry, but I think about it. Both got into an accident. Both are, one acted as an adulterer, meaning he cheated. He didn't consummate the marriage with Judith, but Sai basically was fooling around with someone else's wife, which is what Larry was going to do. So in a sense, Larry comes ahead because he didn't actually do that. And then Sai's doing all this immoral stuff where he's kind of writing letters and throwing shade at Larry anonymously. So I would argue that Larry is more of a serious person and Sai's just better at hiding his skeletons. Yeah, I think, thematically, I'm trying to jump back on this turducken of a thematic area and sort of talk about the bar mitzvah thing, the coming of age. I love that. I think it was, relatable to anyone who's had a bar mitzvah or bat mitzvah or whatever. Anybody who's prepared for a big thing and kind of, also someone who's able to handle it under the influence. Kudos to them. But, I think Jewishly, I'm veering a little bit off track, but I think, the theme of how to handle someone who's a bit different. I think, Arthur's a bit different. They allude to him maybe being gay or maybe being just a little bit neurodiverse. I don't know. But I don't know if that's necessarily a Jewish thing, but I thought this idea of being othered and then trying to find some way to make him feel welcome was kind of a nice way, bringing him in. But Harry, I'm full from this themes category. I'm going to pass it back to you to see if you want any leftovers.
Yeah, for sure. I'll definitely weigh in a little bit there. I was thinking about this thematically, what's going on in this movie? What are its big questions? And it's obviously about this person who's struggling and he's trying to get these answers. And, in one note, we did mention the parable of Job, and just anytime that there's an allusion that's very clearly, Old Testament biblical, from the Torah, it's kind of that to me is a huge thematic connection to Judaism. So,
sure.
That aside, and that's a very clear reading, that a lot of people have had from this movie. So that's obviously there. But, the two things that I felt were were so Jewish in terms of its themes. And the ones that I really respond to are, I don't know if I've mentioned this yet in this episode, but have I spoken about parables yet? Have I mentioned anything along those lines?
I don't think so. It doesn't sound familiar now.
So I'll introduce it now, I guess. But this concept of
I'm joking. You brought it up a bunch of times.
I was going to say, hopefully our audience, unless they started at the ending and just don't know, but I have mentioned that a few times.
Yes.
But that concept of parables and just using parables to tell a story. And we mentioned that it's very midrashic. And I really think that obviously there's something very universal about that. Before I claim that parables were invented or just like predominantly used by, Jewish texts, of course, like they exist in many different cultures and many different histories. But, one of the ways that we really have engaged with like the Torah text, is through this concept of parable. And that's in specific stories that, we learn out messaging from them, like in the Torah itself, but then even sort of, I think of it as a very Talmudic method because, half of like a lot of like when you're reading Talmud, sometimes it's a very explicit, dry and cut like statement of rulings and explaining things. And that's, the stuff that Larry would really like. But very often the rabbis have used that as a sort of device that, they'll use a parable, sometimes with an explanation afterwards, and sometimes just kind of leave you with the parable as you're supposed to learn the story. And that's a text that's a device used to help explain, the Torah itself, in the sort of midrashic sense. And that's also in the, in the Talmud, that's this tool that's used to convey messages and find meaning. And the way that not only is what the rabbis, do in this movie and what, Larry's friends do in this movie and how they recommend him, but even just how the movie itself is functioning and how it's conveying, it's teaching its audience, right? It's tackling these questions of, meaning, why does good things happen to bad people? The movie itself on a very meta level is its own parable because obviously it's an invented story to tell this, but the devices the movie uses throughout, whether it be the dreams, whether it be the stories that people tell, whatever. There's a lot of parables in this movie. So just using that device. Yes. So using that device so clearly, I think was just so Jewish. And then the other big thing in this movie, and obviously that's almost like the parables is like the frame, but the movie itself is about this questioning of faith. And, I've said this on other episodes, but I think that, that sort of uncertainty of faith is like, one of the most, religious struggles, Jewish struggles. And, that question of how can, believing in a God without actually seeing proof, like, it's fundamental, right? That is so much the Jewish experience. And, as much as a guy like Larry is going to be looking for answers and is going to be trying to, find a mathematical proof, right? Because that's how he thinks. He thinks in the world of math. That's like a fundamental tenet to any faith, to any religion, is that there can't be a proof that subsists on us kind of believing in spite of there not being proof. And, I say us because I'm a person who I think is, fascinated by that idea and really enjoys that and thinks that, it creates a very deep connection. I think that's what this movie is capturing. And it's kind of testing its audience with those same questions of, that's what this character of Larry's struggling with. And that's what you can do with this movie. You can try to find meaning, you can make sense of it. But when you inevitably fail, because I think they've sent this movie in too many different directions for you to actually get a cohesive kind of reading that satisfies everything, where everything kind of makes sense and the morality is judged, effectively. So when you inevitably fail, how does that make you feel? Do you believe in it? Were you moved by it? Do you come away with the lesson of, well, at least it's important to help people and that kind of helps you feel good with it? Or does it, shut you down and cause you to kind of take the bribe money and go in that different direction? And I just think the way that the movie is like dealing with that's not just like in the movie, that is the movie. It just, I've done all this setting up for, before we get into the dessert course, which I would say is when we discuss if it's good or bad for the Jews, I'll just volunteer my ranking after all that sort of spilling after this, huge main course I had. And, I think this is another 5 stars. I think this is 5 out of 5 Jewish stars. The content, the themes, the cast and crew are all there. It'd be hard to I'm not sure what it's missing. It'd be hard to nitpick right now and say, well, technically, he goes on this journey about infidelity and that's not explicitly Jewish. Sure, you can pull those threads, but this was such an obviously Jewish movie from the first frame to the last frame. So I'm going to give it the 5 stars. We don't give that out very often on Jews on Film, but this definitely deserves it. Nice. Do you agree with me, Daniel? Do you think that was fair? Did I make a case for it? Do you believe it yourself?
You certainly made a case for it. I want to just touch on one thing before I review it and give it my rating. I think the thing that you talked about of just kind of having all these things, just to continue our sort of food metaphor, which we like so much on this podcast, the idea that this is sort of a buffet of ideas and there's a lot there. There's a lot there for you to choose from. And like, it's similar to the parable about the man who saw the Hebrew letters on the teeth. You can take away from it what you want. And there's a lot out there. They don't necessarily come down on these issues one way or another. I think it's open to interpretation, but I do feel like it is a very Jewish film. I might have to join you there with the 5-star club. I think it's undeniable between the cast and crew, the themes, the content. I think it's all there. I really, the movie did throw me through a loop, but I think the Jewishness is there. And I think that they intended to make something that was confusing, not super satisfying in a Hollywood ending kind of way, not seeing what that appointment was like, or not seeing whether or not they got down to the bunker, or not resolving the story with Mrs. Samsky and seeing if his domestic life opened up and he was more liberated after having, seen her and hung out with her. So yeah, overall, I thought this was a 5-star for sure.
Well,
what's the dessert? Now I'm curious. I
was going to say that brings us to our dessert. Was this good for the Jews? How do you feel about that?
Oh boy. Some of the Jews in this film came off really like, I think maybe one of the few Jews in this film that came off looking super well was, I think, Rabbi Simon, arguably like the least senior of the rabbis. I think the middle and last rabbi were, less satisfying for me as rabbinic sources. I think I want someone who's kind of like down to earth and like a man of the people, as opposed to this sort of frail, aging person who hides behind doors. This is someone who walks out and meets you, as opposed to having a secretary bring them in and things like that. I thought he was good for the Jews. The rest of them, I don't know. I mean, they are Jewish in very many ways, but I think there's not a lot of like redeemable Jewish characters in this film. So I would say that this film was not good for the Jews. Harry, how about yourself?
Yeah. I think, it's in a very Coen Brothers way. All the characters are very ridiculous and, laughable. Yeah. Like, we didn't touch this so much, but other than Larry, who I think has, a certain amount of depth with him, and definitely he goes on a journey.
Yes.
I don't think any of the other characters have anything similar. I think they're all kind of these caricatures that are placed to embody certain, like, just like a certain response to Larry, and they're kind of like set pieces designed to, to kind of trigger certain things in him for him to kind of play off, and they're supposed to like a little bit. And like, I don't think any character, and by design, like not in a flawed way of the film. It's just no character is given enough time and enough resources to have a more complex narrative, other than he's like whatever. They're just depicting different versions of a sense of morality and a sense of engaging with the world than Larry is. So I don't know. I think if you like look at the rabbis, I agree with you. I think if you're not coming at this from like a Jewish and faithful place, right, and you're watching this and you just kind of see these rabbis, I think you're supposed to feel a little bit frustrated like Larry. I think you're supposed to go in with Larry like, I just want answers, and you're supposed to think of these responses as don't worry about it, not for us to know. God has the answers, and we just need to be good people. You might get a little frustrated with that, which I think was part of the point. Totally. So I agree with you. I don't think that there's anything so great. There's no one character that I'd say like that was a great Jew and that was like just a cool person. And, Larry's a little bit of a neurotic mess, and everyone else is kind of, doing their own ridiculous things on the side. So it's definitely not good for the Jews. It's not awful for the Jews. I don't think I hope no one's watching this. I hope no one watches any movie and thinks poorly of the Jews, but not the best representation either. So probably like, I know we're not given a ranking for this, but like, I want to say it's not quite new. It's like neutral bad. That's what I'll call it. Just neutral so I don't get into numbers. I don't want to confuse our other rankings, but not the best look for the Jews, but not the worst either. It's fine.
That's a Jewish answer. And that was our review of A Serious Man. Thanks so much for listening. Please make sure to follow us on all the social media platforms. We're on Instagram and TikTok. And please subscribe and like our podcasts on Spotify or iTunes or wherever else you're listening to this. Thanks, everyone, for listening, and we'll talk to you later. Bye. Jews on Film is hosted and produced by Harry Ottensasser and Daniel Zana. Daniel and Harry edited this episode. Make sure to follow us on Instagram @JewsOnFilm and subscribe to our podcast to get new episodes. Thanks for listening.